the French connection. Louis Philippe and his descendants. The French connection in Twickenham, 1800 to 1932. And I'm very honoured to have these medals given by the French government. You may say, what use are they? Well, in fact, I feel, and I've always felt it proved that I was a lover of France and its culture, which has helped me immensely when I had to take thousands of children both sides of the channel. And I'm a great believer in exchanges. Unfortunately, with all our restrictions now, we can't have home exchanges as we used to. But it's very interesting that I'm in contact with some of my first pupils whom I met over 50 years ago at Hayes Grammar School, and they also went on my exchanges, and several of them ended up marrying French women, and they live in France. So that is something to be proud of. Now, the family tree. It's only a vague family tree, but I think it's very important for you to see all the people whose names are in bold type because they all lived in England. And those were a lot of the people who were part of the French royal family who ended up living in Twickenham, or they were born in Twickenham. Louis Philippe Égalité. He was, as Alan pointed out, Louis Philippe II. Yes, Louis Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans. But Louis Philippe I was the first of the family to become the king of the French. He never was king of France, and he made it very clear that he wasn't the king of France. He was king of the French. Louis Philippe Égalité was descended from Louis XIV's brother Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, and his wife, Henrietta Maria, daughter of Charles I. If you've seen the film Versailles, you will see all these connections. Here is Louis Philippe Duc Égalité, Duc d'Orléans, with his family. So let us look. The first person that we see is Louis Philippe, future king of the French. That is the Louis Philippe who came to Twickenham. He was born in 1773. Next to him is the Antoine Duc de Montpensier, 1775 to 1807. Then the young girl is Mademoiselle. That was her title. Mademoiselle is always the sister of the king. And in fact, Monsieur is always the brother of the king. So Adelaide, 1777 to 1847. Then we have La Duchesse d'Orléans, Louise Marie Adelaide Bourbon. She was the daughter of the Duc de Penthièvre. These are all titles that pop up all the way through this story. The little boy is Charles Comte de Beaujolais, 1779 to 1808. And the lady in the background is none other than Madame de Genlis, tutor to the royal children and mistress of Louis Philippe. Her name was Madame de Genlis, Félicité Ducret d'Aubin, Comtesse de Genlis. She married a young officer. She was introduced to the royal family by Louis Philippe Égalité Joseph's mistress, Madame de Montesson, and that was her niece. Very ambitious, very, very clever. And in fact, there she is. She was an incredible educationalist. She spoke many languages and set up a school for the royal children where they were able to meet other children of their own age. This was a special dispensation from King Louis XVI. As a matter of fact, the school was in a building near the Panthéon. And later on, Louis Philippe's own sons, that is Aumale, etc., went to the Lycée Henri IV, which is opposite. I'll go into that later. In 1785, she visited Twickenham to see Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill. Remember, she was a very literary lady. And he wrote, as the hill would not go to see Madame de Genlis, she had to go to the hill. Famous quotation of Muhammad coming to the hill. She returned again in 1792. She stayed in Lacy House, no longer exists, but it is on the site of what became Gordon House, the main building of Maria Grey College, which became Uxbridge University, and which no longer exists. I think the building still exists, but it's been turned into apartments. Very interesting view there, taken from the little pagoda, looking down the river, and you can see how close it was to Twickenham. And there she is with this rather mystical girl whose name was Pamela. Well, Pamela was supposedly an orphan that Madame de Genlis had adopted, but it is now quite clear that she was in fact the daughter of Louis-Philippe Égalité. Why was she called Pamela? Well, a man called Richardson, one of the first novelists in the English language, wrote a book called Pamela. She married a man, although Mr. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, one of England's greatest dramatists, was rather smitten with her, but she did in fact marry a man called Lord Edward Fitzgerald, an Irish revolutionary, and she died in Paris, but her remains were brought back to England, and she's now interred in the churchyard of Thames Ditton. Now, these are the reasons why Louis Philippe came to Twickenham. Here are the brothers. Montpensier, as I told you, he was died in 1807. And there is Louis Philippe himself, who had been in the armies of Dumouriez, a revolutionary general when they were fighting the Austrians. And he became a general very quickly at the age of 20-something or other. Very young, very brilliant. All three of them eventually met up in Pennsylvania, America, before going to Cuba. And from Cuba, they came to England, and Louis Philippe himself had fled from after the Battle of Valmy, where he fought with Dumouriez against the Austrians. He had gone to Switzerland. From Switzerland, he went to Hamburg and thence to America. The two brothers had spent 3 years in a prison in Marseille in very bad conditions. Their father, unfortunately, in 1793, although it is said he voted the death penalty of his cousin, Louis XVI, he himself was guillotined under the Terror. Another reason for coming to Twickenham was that the Comte de Jarnac had already emigrated there after the Revolution of 1789. And there we see where he lived. It's the large house. in Zion Row. And he had some friends who were called the Hawkins, and they made note of the fact that he was their neighbour. Louis Philippe and his two brothers, first of all, spent a few weeks when they first came to England in Bute Lodge, the home of the Marquis of Bute. Marquis of Bute's fortune was based on coal coming out of Cardiff. Every sack of coal out of Cardiff, I think, had a penny on it, and that all went towards the fortune of the Marquis of Bute. Why were they staying there? Well, he happened to be married to a Coutts daughter, and Coutts were the bankers of the French royal family. After a short while, Louis Philippe moved to High Shot House, Crown Road. As you can see, they were not impecunious. That is a very nice carriage with their arms on it. So what did they do? Well, Montpensier was a poet and a writer, and he wrote the history of the family. He was also very much in love with a girl called Miss Forbes, who lived at North End House. North End House is the north end of Montpellier Row. At the end of Montpellier Row stands today South End House, where in fact the famous English poet of French origin, Walter de la Mare, lived. So Miss Forbes was his lady friend, and they wrote letters to one another, and they kept a long correspondence. How did the brothers entertain themselves? Well, I've told you Montpensier wrote poems and wrote a history, and Louis Philippe, well, he was a great gardener, and he cultivated his roses. Let us say he had an ample supply of fertilizer at the end of his road, because Crown Road was one of the main thoroughfares coming into Twickenham. Beaujolais, Charles de Beaujolais, he was a great hunter, and he would go hunting in the royal parks, and there were many. The brothers would often spend their evenings in York House. York House, for those who do not know, is now the town hall of Twickenham, civic centre, and so that is where many of you probably have already been who've come from abroad, and where we will have many celebrations. This was at the time inhabited by the Prince of Staremberg. He was the Austrian ambassador. He came from a very noble family who had been very, very important in the history of Austria. And there used to be musical evenings, and one of their main things was playing whist. Other people that he met there were people such as the Duke of Kent, Victoria's father, Queen Victoria's father, although she wasn't born until 1817. And this is all much earlier. And in 1807, very sadly, Montpensier died, and he was out of town, but he was buried in the French chapel in Portland. Sorry, he had his service in the French chapel in Portland Square, and he was then interred in Westminster Abbey because he was a prince of the blood. He was a royal prince. So that is why he is buried in Westminster Abbey. The whole of the funeral arrangements were organized by none other than the Comte de Jarnac. The family of the Jarnac were very well important family in French history. And in fact, there was even later during Louis Philippe's reign, a Comte de Jarnac, Comte Chabot de Rohan Chabot de Jarnac, who was the French ambassador to the court of St. James's during the reign of Louis Philippe. So he was very, very distraught by this. And in 1808, he took his brother to Malta, to the Mediterranean, where the climate was far better. They had actually contracted, the two brothers, TB while they had been in the jail in Marseille. In 1808, in 1809, Louis Philippe arrived in Sicily, which was ruled by King Ferdinand and his queen, Maria Carolina, the sister of Maria Antonia, to you, Marie Antoinette. She was also the aunt of Marie-Louise, who was Napoleon I's wife, who was the mother of Napoleon II. I told you about that in the last lecture. So there was a very strong link, and he was a Bourbon. He was actually Ferdinand, the third of Sicily and the fourth of Naples. But during Napoleon's reign, they lost Naples, and Caroline, Bonaparte's husband, Murat, became le roi de Naples. Their daughter was Marie-Amélie. She and Louis Philippe married in 1809. And so she was the niece of Marie Antoinette. Louis Philippe and his wife returned to France in 1814 after Napoleon had abdicated and gone to Elba. They'd already had 2 children by this time in Sicily, in Palermo. In 1815, during the 100 Days, when Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France, arriving in Cannes, and then he made his way up the Route Napoleon to Paris, and as we know, he ruled for 100 days. Louis Philippe left France in 1815, and he settled this time in in George Pocock's house, later to be known as Orleans House. The rent was £250 per annum. In this picture by Attalin, we see the Duke of Orleans and his retinue crossing the River Thames at low tide. Marie-Amélie, with her eldest son, Ferdinand, named after his grandfather, Ferdinand I of the 2 Sicilies, 3rd of Sicily, 4th of Naples. He was known as the Duc de Chartres. The Duc de Chartres is always the eldest son of the Duke d'Orléans. In fact, Louis Philippe, when he was a child, until the death of his father, was the Duc de Chartres. The little girl in the middle, who was born in 1816, was Princess Françoise. Unfortunately, she only lived until 1819. She was baptized in Twickenham Parish Church, St. Mary's, by the family's chaplain, Claude Jérôme Hugo, in the presence of the vicar, Georges Champagne. Interesting that he should have a French name. Also pictured is Mademoiselle Adélaïde. the daughter of Louis-Philippe Égalité, who lived from from 1777 till 1847, a ripe old age. She never married, but she had a great influence on the family. Again, one of the pupils of Madame de Genlis, highly intelligent, and in fact, very Catholic. And in fact, she was very important in the education of the royal children. This is Attalin. Attalin was a general in the armies of Napoleon. He was, in fact, an officier de génie, which is, in fact, an engineering officer, but he was a very, very talented artist. We've already seen one of his pictures. And he lived in Ferry House. By the time that Louis-Philippe went back to France in 1817, during the reign, now consolidated, of Le Comte d'Artois, who became Louis XVIII. And I forgot to tell you that during the stay of 1800 to 1807, Louis-Philippe had patched it up with the other members of his family, namely the Comte de Provence, who became Charles X, and the Comte d'Artois, the future Louis XVIII. So this is a picture of Twickenham Riverside. For those of us who know Twickenham, very little has changed. On the extreme left is the Swan Public House. The building is still there. I think there's been some alterations over the centuries, but it's basically on the same piece of land, about the same size. And the house next door, still there. And then, of course, Ferry House, which is where Attalin lived. The only thing that's changed over the years is that the entrance to the house is on the right-hand side of the building. The building next to it is Mount Lebanon. Notice the great big cedar tree. That was modified over the years, and you will see that later on. This is the heir to the throne. The eldest son, who, when Louis-Philippe was the Duc d'Orléans, was himself the Duc de Chartres. Unfortunately, in 1842, when he went to visit his mother in Ney, he had a carriage accident and fell out of his carriage at La Porte Maillot. I think there was another horse put on, and the tiger, as they're called, the tigre, couldn't control it. He was rushed to a grocery store where he died very ignominiously. He was going to see his mother before he was going off to maneuvers because he was a general in the French army. Ney was the summer home of the French royal family. Unfortunately, the lovely low buildings in the wonderful park were destroyed during the Commune of 1870. You see there his widow. Her name was Ellen de Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She was a Protestant princess, and there she is holding the Duc de Chartres, who then became, in time, the Comte de Paris. All these titles changed, the same as in our royal family. Here we see 1837, Louis-Philippe riding out in front of Versailles. The people in the picture are the Prince de Joinville, who was in the French Navy. Next to him the Duc de Montpensier, and then Namur, Louis Philippe. Oh, sorry, next to him, of course, was Ferdinand, who was the crown prince. Then we see Namur was the youngest son. And next to Louis Philippe, on his left-hand side, was the Duc de Nemours, and the youngest son of those. He wasn't the youngest son. Montpensier was the youngest son. The second youngest son, the fifth son, was none other than the Duc d'Aumale. Duc d'Aumale had a great importance in Twickenham. There was another son, but he died in infancy. He was born prematurely and he died when he was 8. So that's why there were only 5 sons left of the 6. In 1843, Queen Victoria paid a state visit to France, and she stayed in the Chateau d'Eu, as in G-U-E-U, Chateau d'Eu. This was in September 1843. This is rather historic because it was the first time since the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 that a ruling monarch of England had visited France. As you know, Henry VIII came with his retinue to the field of the Champ du Drap d'Or, the Field of the Cloth of Gold, where he was with his retinue, and Francois Ier was with his retinue. That was the last time before 1837 that there had been a state visit to France by a reigning monarch. The return visit was in October 1844. Here we see Louis Philippe in the royal train, which was rather a circuitous route because it went from Paddington to Slough, and then they came from Slough by horse-drawn transport to Windsor. The 1848 line had not been opened. That is the Windsor and Eton line. So they were obliged to go the long way round. The present from Louis Philippe to Queen Victoria was the latest invention, un char à banc, which we call a char-à-banc, un char à banc. And there you see the 4 horses and the people in the char à banc. Queen Victoria is there riding with Louis Philippe in Windsor Great Park. It's very interesting. His daughter, Marie-Louise of Belgium, who had married very young in 1830, Leopold, the King of the Belgians, who was the widower of Charlotte, the daughter of George IV. She said to Queen Victoria, "Don't let my father eat too much, and above all, don't let him get overexcited." Here we are on the day when Louis Philippe was given the Order of the Garter. Note the sash. That is the Order of the Garter. Louis Philippe is very, very tall in comparison with Queen Victoria, who was actually very short. On October the 10th, 1844, the party paid a visit to Louis Philippe's old home, Orleans House. It was owned at this time by the Earl of Kilmorey, Black Jack Needham, who then went on to own none other than Gordon House in Isleworth, and his mausoleum in the shape of a tent is there still. Well, on the 26th of February 1848, there was the revolution where Louis Philippe abdicated. And you heard about that last time when I explained that Napoleon III, as Le Prince Président, or Le Prince Napoleon, Charles Louis Napoleon, rushed over to become the new president. Well, in fact, they said, go away and come back later. And as you know, the rest is history. So where does Louis Philippe go? Well, Louis Philippe went to Clermont. Why did he go to Clermont? His son-in-law, as I explained to you, his daughter Louise d'Orléans, married the King of the Belgians in 1830. She was a lot younger than him. She was born in 1808, so she was only 22 when she married the King of the Belgians, and he was 42. But they had a very amicable relationship, and she had many children by him. Not many, she had quite a few children, one of whom was Charlotte, who became the Empress of Mexico. So, first of all, the whole royal family arrived in Clermont, which, as you know, is a school these days in Esher. You can visit it if you seek special permission. At one time, they opened it on the first Saturday of every month for visitors. No longer, one has to ask for a visit. Last time I gave this lecture was actually as a walking lecture with a friend of mine, and we visited there. Very welcoming they were indeed. This is Charlotte, George IV's daughter. And something I forgot to tell you was that the first picture that you saw of Louis-Philippe Égalité, Louis-Philippe Joseph Égalité, was done by Reynolds in England, because he was often a visitor to George IV, and he in fact had his own racehorses. A great spendthrift, I might say. Here we are, Louise marrying Leopold of the Belgians. She wasn't very happy at the beginning, but in fact they had a pretty good marriage. And there we are. She was married in Compiègne, which is one of the great houses, great palaces just outside Paris. One day, Louis Philippe was staying with his retinue in the Star and Garter Hotel. It's undergone many changes since that picture was taken. And as you know, the Star and Garter home has now been turned from being Les Invalides of England into very expensive flats. They had to vacate for a few months Clermont, because they had a very, very bad drain problem. So in order not to be poisoned, and in order to avoid the smells of the drains at Clermont, which, by the way, was one of the few architectural monuments of Brown, Capability Brown, mainly known as a landscape gardener, architect, but he did actually design that very cubic building of Claremont, which at one time was the home of Clive of India. So while he was staying in the Star and Garter Hotel on the top of Richmond Hill, Louis Philippe was wont to walk quite a lot. And one day he took the ferry from Ham Fields across the river, and while he was wandering around in the gardens of his old home and in the gardens of Marble Hill, he met a gentleman who had been the publican in the Crown, a public house which he knew very well, because Highshot House, there is a picture of Highshot House as it was until about 20 years ago, when it was demolished and replaced by St. George's PLC, the well-known builders. They replaced it by their offices, but actually quite faithfully in the style of Highshot House. Why are there ladies dressed as nurses? Well, it actually became a home for inebriate gentlemen. Fine place to have a house situated across the road from a pub. The publican accosted Louis Philippe and he said, "Sire, do you remember me?" Because one presumes that Louis Philippe used to go across to the Crown for a pint of something or other, or a glass of port. And he said, "No, I don't recognize you," because remember, Louis Philippe spoke fluent English. "I kept the crown," to which Louis Philippe said, "I wish I'd kept mine." But one of Louis Philippe's other little quips was, "If the crown falls, I will pick it up. I'm not going after the crown." When the crown fell off the head of Louis X, Louis Philippe picked it up and became the King of the French. Note, King of the French. Napoleon III was always Emperor of the French. Napoleon I was Emperor of France. Subtle difference. There is his death certificate. He died not in 1997. That is when I managed to obtain the death certificate. He actually died in 1850, age 76. And that he died actually of stomach cancer. He was buried in the crypt of St. Charles Borromeo, a Catholic church where the family were wont to worship. Remember, they arrived in 1848 and they were there. He was there. The whole family lived there, actually. They gradually bought other houses around. In fact, the Duc de Nemours was staying in Mr. Bates's house in Sheen when his father arrived in England via Dieppe. And there they are, various members of the family, burying Louis Philippe, or not really burying, but laying him to rest in the crypt of St. Charles Borromeo. Very interesting to note that mausoleum, which is still in existence, although there's nobody in it anymore. The last member of the family to leave was Victoria, who was the Duchesse de Nemours, who was a cousin of Queen Victoria's, and she didn't leave there until 1966. So they were first of all buried in the crypt of St. Charles Borromeo, which is in Heath Road, Weybridge, not very far from where I live at the moment, and not very far from Claremont. Who's in the picture? Well, there of course is not Ferdinand, he was already dead. The man, the tall man in the picture is Le Prince de Joinville. He was an admiral in the French Navy, and in fact in 1840 he was the one that brought back the remains of Napoleon I to France in a ship which was called La Belle Poule, a beautiful chicken. Strange name. And then, of course, the body was interred in state in Les Invalides. The gentleman next to him is the Duc d'Aumale. The other gentleman is le Duc de Nemours, and the little boy is the Comte de Paris, who was the heir to the throne. There is Marie-Amélie, who was born in Palermo in 1782, and she was 84 when she died in her home in Clermont. Next, that is Dreux. Dreux is the royal burial mausoleum, and there are an awful lot of them. Over the years, they all were brought back from where they died and interred in this wonderful building. It's well worth a visit. And there we see the statue of Louis Philippe with Marie-Amélie. The next generation. Well, there's the Duc d'Aumale. Duc d'Aumale was a very brilliant young man. He actually was second in the exams when he took the exams for the baccalaureate in the whole of France. It all goes back to Madame de Genlis and her determination to educate the royal children as other children. But they weren't just educated as other children, they were the cleverest people of their generation. Wonderful collection of books. He left all his money, not all his money, but all his goods, all his books, all his paintings, and the Chateau de Chantilly. As a very young child, he had inherited the wealth of les Princes de Condé. The Princes de Condé were a very rich branch of the Bourbon family, and they owned the wonderful Chateau de Chantilly, which is another place which is well worth visiting. So there we see him as a young officer. We see him as a 26, 27-year-old officer who conquered the Arabs when they were having a revolt in Algeria. And there he is with his wife, Marie-Caroline. Interesting, her name is very similar to his grandmother's own name. Marie-Caroline was from Salerno. They were all related. She died relatively young, before she was 50, and she had 4 children. Only 2 survived into teenage years, but unfortunately both their sons, the Duc de Chartres and the Duc de Guise, died very, very young. The Duc de Chartres died in Australia of a nasty fever, and the other boy died of mumps in Paris just on the day that he was taking his baccalaureate. So he was completely without issue. There was his wonderful house. It, of course, is the former house of George Pocock, the former residence where he was brought up as a child in Twickenham. And that is Orleans House. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in 1926 when it was left to go to rack and ruin. Most of the big houses in Twickenham were owned by the Cunard family, the family who were the ship owners. And unfortunately, they were also developers. They were the people that wanted to develop Marble Hill Park. But an Act of Parliament in 1905 called Save the View stopped Marble Hill Park from being developed. But underneath Marble Hill Park, there are already the foundations of houses. So, the Duc d'Aumale in 1860 was responsible for the founding of the Twickenham Rowing Club, one of the oldest rowing clubs on the River Thames. Note the colours of the rowing club. They are the French royal colours of the Valois family. Here are various activities in 1866. There was a great fête champêtre, a fete organised in the grounds of Orleans House to raise money for the poor French who were emigrants in London and who were impoverished. Notice the wonderful interiors. Now, the next person to come was the Comte de Paris. The Comte de Paris married his cousin, who was the Infanta of Spain. In 1844, if you remember when they came over for the state visit, it was envisaged that there would be an entente cordiale between the two countries. But what scuppered that was when Henri, Duc de Montpensier, married the Infanta of Spain. So it didn't go down very well with the British government, who could see that possibly the French were trying to get hold of Spain. So his wife was the daughter of his uncle, Montpensier, so they were first cousins. A lot of marriage between the first cousins. They say that isn't a very good thing. They were married in 1864 in St. Raphael's Church in Surbiton. St. Raphael's was established as the second church after the Act of Emancipation, when Catholics were allowed to worship in public. The first church was St. Elizabeth's in Richmond. This is the first of at least 4 marriages by the French royals when they were living in England. Here we have the Prince de Joinville with his bride, Francesca of Brazil. She was the daughter of the King of Portugal and the sister of the Emperor of Brazil. Their family name was Duarte, and they lived in Mount Lebanon, which, as I pointed out before, was next to Ferry House, and in fact, it was developed when they were living there. Unfortunately, it was burnt down by fire. One wonders why. Again, all of that land was owned by the Cunards. In 1871, the French royal family all went back to France. But unfortunately, after the marriage of Marie-Amélie, who was the daughter of the Comte de Paris, to Carlos of Portugal, there were monarchist demonstrations in Paris. So in 1886, they were asked to leave. Comte Robert, who was married in St. Raphael's to his cousin Isabella, ended up living in Sheen House. He lived there from 1886 until 1889. He then moved to Stowe, which is just outside London, where there is a famous school now, and he died there in 1894. His son, who was Louis-Philippe Robert, known as Philip VIII, in 1897, he bought the home where he had been born for the sum of £13,000, and he spent, it is estimated, about £30,000 on the restoration. But he didn't live there very often because he was often away hunting. He didn't get on with his Austrian Archduchess Dorothy, who was left behind in Twickenham. And he made himself very unpopular in 1900 when he supported the Boers against the British, although, of course, he'd actually been educated at Sandhurst and had been a serving officer in the Indian Army. In 1906, it was sold to the Ratan Tatas. Now, the marriage of 1886 was when this gentleman, that's Manuel's parents, were married, and that caused a lot of trouble in France. That's why they all came back. And in 1910, his father, who was the King of Portugal, Carlos IV, was assassinated along with his brother, and he ruled for a very short time. And in 1911, he came to Twickenham to live in Fulwell Lodge. Fulwell Lodge no longer exists. It was after his death in 1932 when he died of an edema caused by a swelling of his throat. Very suddenly died. Nobody could understand why, because he was a very fit man. He had just been to see a tennis match at Wimbledon. Very keen tennis player, very fit. Died at the age of 42 in 1932. His widow, who was from the Hohenzollern family, that is the Prussian royal family, she eventually remarried, and she lived for quite a long age, till quite an old age. They had no children. She had no children by either of the marriage. And that is where the story of the French royal family in Twickenham ends. Thank you very much. Oh, just to let you know, that is a little map of all the places in Twickenham and in Richmond where the French royal family resided from 1800 until 1932. And in memory of Dr. T.H.R. Cashmore, whose little book, which is probably still available, gave me the inspiration to research and lecture on the French royal family. Thank you very much.